Welcome back, geologists, and we're going to pick up where we left off with the Orodovician's Great Biodiversity Event. We left off talking about corals, and I'll spend quite a bit of time talking about how they live and their characteristics. Corals, like other filter feeders, are unique in the fact that they make their own shelly material out of calcium carbonate, CaCO3. Most are colonial, but occasionally you can get an individual animal like a rugosa coral that could actually make just one of these that they can live in as a solitary unit. But in most cases, corals are colonial. And you can see how they work as we go through these pictures and show you that they can make large reefs. Now, during the Ordovician, corals did not make large reef systems at all. They made small ones. They would grow in size substantially during the Silurian and the Devonian, which were the great times of coral reefs that occurred in geologic past, so much more than what we have today. One thing about corals that's worthy to note is that they require very special conditions to live in. Number one is they like to live between about 30 degrees north and south of the equator. That's pretty standard today, and it's because they require equitable, warm conditions. Corals need enough movement of water that they can reach their little corallites out to grab food and bring it in. Now, something that makes all cnidarians unique is the fact that they have a stinging nematocyst. And the nematocyst, in most cases to humans, is not harmful. There is a case where that is not true. If you've ever come in contact with fire corals, they kind of have a white tip on the top and they're orange. They will light you up like a Christmas tree, and not a pleasant experience, I might add. I have a couple of scars on my legs from diving where I accidentally rubbed up against a fire coral, which is one reason you should always learn how to control your buoyancy if you're a diver. Just keep that in mind if you're going to go scuba diving anytime soon where there are coral reefs. Now let's get back to the Ordovician. This is a rugose coral. This is a tabulate. So oftentimes this coral right here is referred to as a horn coral. Makes sense, doesn't it? It kind of looks like one. Rugose corals can be individual solitary animals or colonial. In most cases, they're colonial like most corals are. But in the Ordovician, and even throughout parts of the rest of the Paleozoic, we will see them as solitary animals. Be clear that both of these corals are going to go extinct in the Permian mass extinction event, never to be heard from again. And a new type of coral will replace them, just what we have today, called scleractinian corals. When you come over here and you see the one that looks like honeycomb, we call those tabulate corals. Now, honeycomb may be its nickname, but the proper way to refer to these are tabulate corals. So let's start with rugose. And rugose corals are the same body plan as most corals, so we'll kind of look at them first and show you how corals are set up. So the individual horns would be these items right here, these cavities that you see. So remember, they can be individual like these guys right here. So the little cup would sit in here, and the cup is called the theca, and then each individual place that is inside of these little lines that you see right there, those are going to be called the septae. And these individual things are filled up with these little flower-looking things, which are the tentacles or polyps, which are referred to as corallites. It's important to note that all corals are cnidarians, so they have stinging nematocysts. So these things right here will actually reach up and grab whatever microscopic material that they might be looking for as a filter feeder to eat. So understanding how corals live, they must have some kind of substrate to live on that's hard, that they can encrust and build their calcium carbonate shells, and they must be able to have enough flow of water in the area that they can get the materials that are suspended in the water column to eat. Now, how do we distinguish these different types of species of rugose corals, or any coral for that matter? We look at the number of septae that exist in each and every one of the cavities. So that may seem a little cumbersome, but nevertheless, that is how coral species are identified. So remember that rugose corals are horn corals. So let's take a look at tabulate corals. Tabulate corals have kind of a similar body plan to rugosa, but they don't have that horn shape. Instead, they have long skinny tubes that they fill in, and each one of these is going to be the little septae that the corallites sit in, where the theca cup is, and they're going to operate just like a rugose coral in how they feed. In other words, the corallites are going to have their little stinging nematocyst, and they're going to be looking for microscopic material to pull out of the water column. So they first appear in the Ordovician. They become very prevalent during the Silurian and the Devonian, and they will hang out in geologic rocks and past until the end of the Permian, where they go extinct with poor rugose corals. This is a tabulate coral. And as you can see, it looks much like a honeycomb. So each one of these little individual openings right here is going to be a place where corallites would have lived. A good indication that this was a colonial animal in geologic past. Here's one where sediments kind of filled in the gaps between them all, but you can make out the individual honeycomb patterns right here and see how they look. So these would have been colonial tabulate corals back in the early Paleozoic. A good look at tabulate corals right here. Can you see the individual tubes that make up the honeycomb pattern there? These are the kinds of things that would encrust together to make very large reefs during the Silurian and the Devonian. Another worthy organism to discuss are cephalopods. They became very prevalent during the Ordovician, and most of the ones we saw were non-coiling. They were either nautiloids or they were belemnites that we will see a little later in the semester as they become important. This type of framework right here, this type of very fossiliferous, just loaded with invertebrates of cephalopod nature. These are very common from a place called Morocco. And so Ordovician rocks are full of these guys. The soft animal actually fills up the last few chambers of the shell that it makes and closes off the rest of it for buoyancy control. So cephalopods can be straight up and down, but they all have segmented sections that they build inside of their shell. So gastropods are the same way. Mollusks work very similar to that. That's why they're all a part of phylum Mollusca. So nautiloids, like today's nautiloids, we would have started to see them in the Ordovician, and we would have seen this type very common, like I said, from Morocco during the Ordovician as well. We don't have ammonites yet. They won't come about till the Devonian. So don't confuse the Paleozoic or the Ordovician versions and the Silurian versions of nautiloids, which are cephalopods, from what we see a little later on in the rock record. Well, trilobites can continue to be successful in our Ordovician seas, and no surprise why. We have lots of epiric sea continental shelf for them to live in. They're having lots of real estate to choose from. Things are looking really good for trilobites. More organisms are there, which means they're dying, which gives them more to eat on. Of course, they also have more predators to contend with. So I wanted to point out a few things about trilobites while we're here. Notice this cute little eyes that he has. Remember, not all trilobites have eyes. Some are blind. And then you can see his head, his thorax, which is where we determine what kind of species he is, and then his rear end right here. This one probably needed to burrow in sediment. That's probably what these side appendages are for. Could have been used for some swimming, because so keep in mind most trilobites were bottom dwellers, benthic animals, but some could actually propel through the water and be nekton type of animals. So interesting to think about the variety that we're going to have with trilobites. Remember, they took a serious hit at the end of the Cambrian, where they're fixing to get another serious hit at the end of the Ordovician as well. This is my personal favorite of all trilobites, the Snowplow trilobite. I just like the body plan of them. They're very simple, they're not ugly, they're, to me, very beautiful animals, and they epitomize the body plans of what trilobites are. Matter of fact, this is probably what most people would recognize as a trilobite, not this guy right here. Nevertheless, they are both still trilobites. A very important fossil to discuss in Orodovician conversations would be graptolites. First of all, what are they? They're invertebrates, so you got to realize that these are not just some kind of strange thing. They're actually a living organism. Phylum Hemichordata is where they fall. And these guys definitely are free floaters, so they're going to be the phytoplankton type of material, plankton in terms of being floaters through the ocean currents. Some were actually bottom dwellers, benthic, where they actually attach themselves to the bottom of the ocean floor, but most of them just free floated throughout the ocean currents. So let's talk about why they're so excellent in terms of Orodovician aged rocks. Most species didn't exist for very long, and since most species appeared in the Orodovician and most went extinct at the same time, they make great markers for Orodovician aged rocks. Now, the graptolites didn't go extinct at the end of the Orodovician, but many of the species did. So we use them as an excellent marker, and they tend to be found in the same type of rock worldwide, which are usually dark shales, and they are found at the bottom of the ocean. So these things would die and they would sink all the way to the bottom of the ocean, get buried in these shales, and then you're left behind with this kind of material right here. So most all graptolites have a body plan that looks very similar to this. You're going to see these little ridges on the outside. Those are going to be their feeding tentacles for the most part. And so these animals are filter feeders. That's all that they are. This guy is going to make it through the Orodovician extinction event, the Devonian extinction event, and then they finally go extinct at the end of the Mississippian period. So they don't even make it to the Permian mass extinction event. But nevertheless, Orodovician rocks are very famous for containing graptolites. When you think of the word graptolite, like here are some right here. Can you see those teeth-looking structures right here? Here's a really good one right here. They're all over this rock. The word grapto actually means write, and lithos means stone. So written on stone is basically what their name means. And it looks like someone just drew these teeth-looking markers all over the rock. Well, keep in mind that they're not necessarily teeth. It's just their feeding appendages. They were more three-dimensional when they were alive. As they got squished and buried into sediment, they got flattened out. And then you have their carbonized remains, for the most part, left in rock material. Here's an excellent graptolite fossil. Take a look at their apparatuses for feeding in this mechanism, and remember that they were free-floating animals. Graptolites are outstanding index fossils for the Orodovician. Ostracods are the next fossil we're going to investigate. They're very fascinating, not just because of the way they look, but they're fascinating in terms of how we use them for biostratigraphy, and I'll get into that shortly. They look kind of like a kidney or a lima bean. So if you hate lima beans, don't take it out on ostracods. I think you'll think they're kind of cool after you learn about them. They are like a shrimp. They're a very tiny version of a crustacean, so they're arthropods. And they were filter feeders of their times, little scavengers, ate the materials, most of them at the bottom of the ocean floor. Some of them were pelagic. However, we do know this about them. They are one of the most complete animals that appear in every geologic period from the Cambrian all the way to geologic present. And that makes them have a super complete fossil record. While the entire animal is not preserved, we're really only looking for a special part of the animal that we look for in rock layers. Since they are so prolific in certain types of marine rock, like coquina, for example, as soon as we find their fossils and we can identify that specific piece, then we can narrow the window of when that rock was actually deposited, along with a lot more information. So this guy is a modern day ostracod. Let's look at one from geologic past. As you can see, this may look tiny to you. This was as big as an ostracod will ever be. And they got that big during the early part of the Paleozoic. Now, interesting to understand that these guys can live in multiple environments, not just in the ocean, but of course that's where they lived during the early Paleozoic. They can also live at the bottom of lakes. And so that means we can find their fossils in multiple places. What is unique about them is a special part of the animal that we look for that will survive in rock layers, meaning their body part doesn't disintegrate. This particular piece gives us a lot of information, such as what was the temperature like? How did they live? That's paleoecology stuff. That may seem like it's impossible to know simply by this one part of the animal, but it's very testable, it's very prevalent, and so it gives us a lot of information. It can tell you about the salinity concentrations, the temperature of the water depth, all of these really important pieces of information that by itself may not seem important, but in context with an entire paleo ecosystem becomes very, very critically important to telling the story of where this animal lived. One of the most fascinating parts about ostracods is how they're used in industry. They are actually used to help identify pockets of fossil fuels. And so while ostracods themselves are not the big producers of fossil fuels, they can be good biomarkers for those rocks that contain them, along with another fossil we'll be learning about. But since they're still with us today, we have a record that's very complete of places that have fossil fuels, and ostracods can be used to help mark those. These are some of the lima bean shaped ostracods I was talking about. So I used to not really like ostracods because I hate lima beans, but nevertheless, I have learned to love them because they are very important little creatures for helping us find oil and gas. So when you look at them with a dollar sign, they have a completely different appearance and livelihood for usefulness for humans. So that brings us to the next animal that is important for biostratigraphy, called a conodont. Well, what does conodont mean? Con, or cono, means cone, and the teeth are the dots. So if you've been to an orthodontist, you've been to somebody that looks at your teeth. So these are teeth-like apparatuses that are found in this dude right here. We think it's an eel or something like that. We know they come from an animal that belongs to phylum Chordata, so that's important to understand that Chordata has been around for quite some time. These guys will have a pair of these in each side of the mouth, and as they die, these fossils get left in the rock record, and since the eel is not necessarily going to have the rest of him preserved, this part stays along and stays in rock layers for long periods of time. We suspect this guy was a swimmer. If they're anything like eels today, if you've been scuba diving and had the kind of freaky experience of having an eel swim by you, it's a little eerie. And I've had that happen, and you can see their mouths, and if you've seen them open and close their mouths, they have teeth that look somewhat similar to this today even. What's really fascinating about conodonts is how industry uses them. Now, they have a very narrow window of usefulness. Since they appear, they really stay prevalent in rock layers, and then they kind of go extinct at the end of the Triassic. So we don't have much use for conodonts after Triassic aged rock materials, but in those areas of geologic time where we could produce large concentrations of petroleum and other types of fossil fuel products like natural gas, these conodonts are extremely useful in biostratigraphy, and here's why. The coloration from light over here to darker colors on this side, the color matters because it tells us the temperature in which the conodont has been subjected to metamorphism. So as these rock layers that contain the conodont teeth apparatuses get buried under new rock layers, they start to undergo metamorphism at depths. So the more pressure and heat applied to them dictates a specific color conodont. How does that relate to oil and gas? Here's how. If I'm looking for oil, I would look for a specific color conodont. If I was looking for natural gas, I would look for one that's undergone a higher color change, and that would give me an indication of what type of deposit that we would be finding. We would use other tools as well in the rock layers and cores that we would take out of the ground to make that determination. But in short, that's how conodonts are used. So ostracods and conodonts kind of play an important role in the oil and gas industry, and they're little bitty. These fossils are not big, but yet they play a huge role in finding these very important, useful resources that humans need in order to make energy. Stromatoporoids, what are these? They are not stromatolites. Let me say that again. Stromatoporoids are not stromatolites. And you need to understand that they are a sponge-like creature. They are not an algae-bearing organism like single-celled cyanobacteria that makes up a stromatolite. They are very close in resemblance of how they make their structures. So even to someone with a trained eye like myself, it would be easy to mistake one for the other. So these were dominant reef builders starting in the Middle Ordovician, and they would continue to be so, and we still have them with us today. So what do? They make large mounds, much like a stromatolite. They'll build layers, and the layers of material are actually somewhat different than stromatolites. So they're, instead of make a muddy material, they make a calcium carbonate based material. And they'll make pillars of themselves, much like a stromatolite will, and they build up towards the top of the water surface so that they can actually feed. Because remember, poriferas are sponges. So a little bit about what sponges do. Sponges are they're filter feeders, but they actually are instrumental in cleaning water columns. So if you had a coral reef void of sponges, it would be really icky. It would have a lot of slimy stuff like algae. And another organism that helps clean up the water and the ground and the sediment, in particular the sediment, are echinoderms like sea urchins. So typically a coral reef will have a plethora of very different types of organisms that each serve an ecological niche in order to make that coral reef a healthy place for everybody to live. So the layers closest to the surface of the skeleton resemble living tissue, and those further away have been backfilled with calcite. So the older the layer, the more calcium carbonate the stromatoporoids are. So these will be important as we discuss some of the big reefs of the Silurian and the Devonian. So keep in mind that stromatoporoids are going to be important to the development of coral reefs or reef-like structures. Very important development in the Ordovician. The earliest plants appear on land. Now you need to think about how significant this is. As soon as plants get on land, it's kind of the field of dreams. Build it and they will come. So as plants appear, the animals will be not far behind. So the first land plants make their debut in the Ordovician. Let's talk about this and talk about what kind of plants were there, because they're very primitive. They were non-vascular. So what's the difference between a vascular and a non-vascular plant? I get this question every semester. First of all, vascular plants are more advanced, and that's what you're used to seeing most of the time are vascular plants. They have a very specialized set of tissue systems and cells that allow for water movement and nutrients throughout their plant system. Most of them have roots, not all, but most do. Non-vascular do not have these specialized cells and are usually very small in size and have to live in areas that contain water because they cannot produce and store that water themselves. So that's the difference between a vascular and a non-vascular plant. Ordovician land plants were non-vascular. We don't have a rock record of any showing that were vascular. So what would be some examples that you might expect to see? Moss, liverworts, and you're looking at a liverwort right here, and we still have those today. So non-vascular plants are in existence, but the most notable types that you'll find in modern day, and certainly in the rock record, would be vascular plants. Couple of challenges that plants and any animal that moves on land are going to have to deal with, and this will become a theme as we look at the evolution of organisms, both plants and vertebrates, of how they moved and colonized lands. So let's look at the 4 major problems that they're going to have to deal with in order to be successful. The first thing they're going to have to contend with is how do they prevent from drying out? That's called desiccation. So that's important if you are a water-dwelling organism. Let's say you're a fish, and a fish is going to evolve ultimately into an amphibian. How do you deal with that issue of drying out on land? Long term, you're going to have to deal with issues such as, how am I going to survive just to get from point A to point B? How am I going to reproduce? So forth. So those are very important things to consider, is the desiccation. Number 2, how do you deal with the old problems of a body plan that can be able to survive in cases of 4 feet, 2 feet, or if you're a plant, some kind of a root system that lets you grow vertically to be able to photosynthesize. Number 3, very important if you're going to be a species of any sort, how can you reproduce outside of a water environment? This was a big problem for amphibians, and that's why the evolution of the first reptile was such a big deal. And we'll be getting to that a little later in the semester. Not very late though, just a couple of days from now. Number 4 is something we all have to deal with as we age, but nevertheless, this was an immediate problem. How do you deal with gravity? If you're coming out of the water, the first thing that you notice on Earth is a gravity issue. And so I can understand that from having done a lot of scuba diving. I'll tell you a quick story here. My husband used to be part of a nonprofit organization that he and his brother ran out of California. And the nonprofit was designed to help quadriplegics and paraplegics be able to utilize their limbs in a water environment. So they would get them in scuba gear, teach them and certify them how to scuba dive, and they could slightly move their limbs that were paralyzed when they got in neutral buoyancy. So as soon as you put them back in gravity, that was impossible to do. So as soon as they would surface out of water, that was impossible for them to achieve the same goal. So imagine that plants and animals coming out of the water will have the same challenges of how do you deal with this gravity issue. So I would think that that would be a problem long term for any organism on Earth or a planet that had gravity. So we have to conclude the Orodovician with one of the most important elements of it, which was we had this great biodiversity expansion event. I mean, we just great amounts of organisms radiated, and we're going to have a major loss at the end of the Orodovician. This is one of the 5 Hall of Fame mass extinction events. So what caused it? The theory currently is this, that as Gondwana traveled over the South Pole while it was drifting, it caused a major ice age in terms of glaciers to form at the base of Gondwana land. How do we know this happened? We can actually find glacial evidence of glacial striations, moraines. Might even surprise you that even in one of our famous deserts that's in Africa today, that we actually have glacial deposits that date back to this time frame. Nevertheless, here's what died off. 60% of all marine genera died. There was a massive hit to the ocean. 25% of all the families went extinct. Now keep in mind, we had just moved the first plants onto land. We don't have any animals on land yet. We'll get those in the Silurian. But this means that the next period or 2 should be a time of great recovery from such a huge loss of animals in the ocean. So you got to think about how glaciation would cause such a mass extinction event to occur. If you're making large, wide-scale continental and valley glaciers, especially continental, that's going to suck up sea ice and it's going to suck up ocean content, which means you'll drop the continental shelves off of the continent that were just in a Pyrrhic sea of the Tippecanoe, and you're going to drop it, and these animals are going to have nowhere to go. Of course, sea level is going to come back up as these glaciers melt, and the Tippecanoe will be at its peak during the Silurian period. So know that the Orodovician ends with this horrible mass extinction event Some scientists rank this as the second worst, most call it the third worst, but nevertheless, it is certainly one that is worthy of noting that we had a significant blow to life on Earth at the end of the Ordovician. So looking at the Ordovician highlights, I might ask you, what is the organism in the upper right-hand corner? Why is it significant? That's coral, specifically a tabulate coral. So in each period, did something first appear, like corals in the Ordovician or bryozoans, for example? What was the age of name? In this case, it was the age of the Great Biodiversity Event. Were there any mountain building events? In the case of the Ordovician, there were. And in that specific situation, which side of the craton, which margin were they notorious for showing up on? Eastern, western, southern, which side? These are the kinds of things you're going to need to know for test purposes. So a little bit about the Ordovician. This was a time of recovery after the Cambrian losses that we had, and the late Cambrian and then the Ordovician at the very beginning, where the Sauk Sea totally regressed off of the craton. Then it comes back in the form of tippy canoe by the middle Ordovician through the late Ordovician, and then we get glaciation that causes sea level to drop for a while with the tippy canoe. That leads to this massive extinction event that makes marine life basically have a stalemate for a brief period of time, and then it was going to recover in the Silurian and the Devonian periods. So make sure that you're kind of being able to tell the storyboard of what first appeared, if something went extinct during a geologic period, if there's an index fossil that we mentioned that's important for that period. In the case of Orodovician, we talked about graptolites are an excellent index fossil for this period. Those are the kinds of things that you're going to need to know. So I will see you at the next lecture for Silurian, and you have a wonderful day. Bye.